Kusalasara, and I'm really happy to be able to carry on discovering more about Milarepa with this series. I just find it one of the most sort of rewarding and interesting and colourful topics to study, if you can call a person a topic. It's more sort of more succulent than that, reading Milarepa. And we're following vaguely, we're sort of wandering vaguely through this book, The Yogi's Joy, which is written by our teacher Sangharachita. But I've also been, looking at, there's more primary source material, so there's the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, which isn't 100,000 songs, it's some, quite a lot of songs of Milarepa. And then there's also a biography, the life of Milarepa. So these are also really, actually they're quite readable, especially the biography is quite readable, quite enjoyable reading. So that's more primary source material. But the Yogi's Joy is a really good guide, because I think sometimes we can just read. I mean, this is from medieval Tibet, and so it might just seem like enjoyable, exotic adventures. But the Yogi's Joy really helps us to understand what the spiritual and symbolic significance between some of the things that are being talked about. Yeah, so I'll just do a little summary in case some of you haven't been to the previous seminars on Milarepa. So Milarepa is a Tibetan, he was a Tibetan living in the 1000s, and he's a legendary figure, so he's a historical figure, but he's sort of become much bigger than a historical figure. He's one of the most celebrated Buddhist figures. You could sort of think of him as a saint in Tibet, and he embodies a certain lifestyle to the highest degree. So he's a yogi, which means that he's a practitioner who isn't attached to any kind of monastery. So he's a free, wandering Buddhist practitioner, but very, very, very disciplined. And he's also a bit of a wizard, so you could think of him, archetypally as a wizard. And his life story sort of goes from the dark magic to light magic, from the dark to the light. And we have covered that, but it's just worth summarising again that when Milarepa was younger, he wasn't dealt with fairly. Let's just put it. He and his family weren't dealt with fairly, and in order to sort of combat this injustice around land and property, he did what we all do, is learn black magic, and killed quite a number of people by summoning up various spells and incantations, and he realised that this was actually not really helping him. So it was after that he began to train under another teacher, and his teacher, his guru, Marpa, put him through a whole series of trials, which involved building towers and knocking them down again, in order to purify his evil actions, in order to get him out of the destiny of the consequences of those evil actions. So he really had to sort of be pushed to work very, very hard in order to do that. And he proved an adept pupil, and where most of us would have given up, maybe after one tower had been built and knocked down again, we might have thought, I'm not going to do that anymore, kind of towers. He kept on going, yeah. And I think one of the things about that is that there was something in him that knew he was on the right path. And even though it's unenviable to be building, I mean, he would have been doing it by hand. He obviously didn't have a digger or anything. So he was doing it, and he was doing it pretty much on his own. And he was wearing himself out, absolutely exhausting himself. But there's something, if you know that you're onto the right thing, there's something quite enviable about that. You know that you're on the right thing, you'll do almost anything, and you can put up with almost anything. And I think that's interesting, just that if we don't believe in it, then we won't build any towers. But if we know it's going to do something for us, if we believe in it, then we'll do a lot. Yeah. So that's, yeah, in a way, that's just a small example of the sort of extravagance of Milarepa's life story. It's just everything is heightened, everything is 10 times more magical, 10 times more difficult than any other fairy story. So it's got that kind of fairy story symbolic dimension to it. And it's also very funny. Some of it's really quite humorous. He was unconventional. There was a convention of yogis, so wandering or unattached. They weren't always wandering, actually. Sometimes they were meditating for long times in the caves of the Himalayas. But he wasn't the only one. He wasn't breaking ground by doing that. But nevertheless, he was, even for a yogi, he was very unconventional. He wasn't bothered about wearing clothes, for instance. Like sometimes he wore a cotton cloth, but his sister, they have quite a long, maybe we'd say complicated relationship nowadays, was quite ashamed of his indecency, so he wasn't bothered about wearing anything, which for those days, that was just as indecent as it is now to be talking to your disciples with no clothes on. Yeah, we keep our clothes on at the Buddhist centre, especially with a camera. Since the filming came in, so there's this trajectory of moving from the darkest world to the lightest world of the Dharma. But there's also this journey that's after that's described his whole teaching life and his whole practice life. So we get from the songs of Milarepa, which is how he communicated, we get these insights into the inner world of the practitioner and these successive states of realization and the successive openings up to a bigger reality. And that's, I should just say that it's called the Songs of Milarepa because that's how he tended to communicate. He did converse as well, but he's following his tradition, and you get this in the Buddha's day. The Buddha would sometimes have these utterances of inspiration, which seem to come from an even deeper place than a Buddha would normally communicate. So these upwellings, these utterances of inspiration, and the Buddha's there's a collection in the Pali canon called the Udana of this, where the Buddha is said to have had these utterances of inspiration, and this is how Milarepa communicates very often, and he sings these songs. His posture he's often depicted with his hand like that, and that would normally, we'd think of that as listening to what's outside, but it's an indication of he's listening from within, he's listening from his inner world. So he would sing songs of joy, he would sing teachings, he would sing about his life of practice, all sorts of things. And yeah, one of the qualities, one of the things that he does sing about quite a lot is his rigorous mindfulness practice. Okay, so he's a man. It's an interesting thing about discipline and liberation, which really come together in Milarepa. One can't exist without the other. Well, the liberation can't come without the discipline. And he often sings about the rigours of his mindfulness practice. And I find this really exciting because he's... Okay, I'm going to make a small confession. Sometimes I think mindfulness is a bit boring. It's sort of just the words. I don't know, I think sometimes it can be a bit reductive, so it can be a bit like, or I can maybe perhaps misinterpret it as a bit like sort of walking very slowly through the world and maybe arranging some pebbles nicely in one spot and some nice twigs, and everything's a sort of nice subtle grey colour. Do you know those leaflets? Anyway. Yes, but what mindfulness in its entirety is hugely liberating. It's like much more liberating than our advertising might say for a mindfulness course. The colour and the imagination that can be let in, that can grow, that could be fostered by a rigorous mindfulness practice. It can't really be described. Maybe I'll talk about that a bit more later. Actually, yeah. But it does. This world that's inhabited by all these different kinds of beings, and it's Milarepa's visionary world. It demonstrates something, and sometimes Buddhism can be described. I heard this recently, actually, Buddhism being described as joyless. Someone said, isn't Buddhism a bit joyless? Or it can also, there's an accusation of it being nihilistic, or anti-life or anti-pleasure. So a life of renunciation, or which is what we all do when we are sitting down to meditate, is a small renunciation, a radical one actually. It can be seen as nihilistic or life-denying or joyless. But when we hear the exuberance of Milarepa's songs, his delight in his life of practice, that can serve as an inspiration for us and a sort of refute against that accusation. Or even if we might, in our own minds, we might be pitting these kind of two views together. We might be deciding whether to go to the Buddhist centre to meditate, or there might be something much more stimulating on offer. We might be deciding to go to, I don't know what you might have lined up in your social calendars, and because we want to go to the party or the pub or the more obviously exciting thing. We might be pitting that sort of thing in our minds, like, oh, I don't have to. I don't always have to do the quiet, slightly dry thing or something. It might be convenient for us to start thinking about our practice like that if we want to do both, if we want to do other things as well. But it's not true, and we have to really look at that. We have to really look at that. I don't know if those of you who've been on retreat, sometimes in the mornings, there's a lovely sunrise or something, and I think, oh, it's nice out here. I just don't want to go inside and meditate. Which, that would be okay sometimes. But the habit, do you know what I'm getting at? The sort of, there's some nods. Are there any shakes? The view that we're building up there is that we're not going to be rewarded by doing the quieter, more subtle work. And Milarepa as a source of inspiration. Well, he's a little like a hero. We can think of him as a spiritual hero, and although we may not make the same kind of lifestyle choices as him, we can involve his life in our lives more than we think. Yeah. So I want to look a bit more about this, the kind of world Milarepa inhabits. So in the collection of songs, the first whole section of songs of Milarepa are about him conquering demons. So that, it's not like he lives in a human world that happens to have some spirits around. Like they form part of the significant body of his interactions are with non-humans. And there's other things. He flies. He can change into different shapes. He can put his hand through solid objects. He does this in order to, not just for fun, but in order to demonstrate Dharmic teachings. And one of the things I think we can what do I want to say? So with this kind of world that's populated by all these amazing creatures and animals that speak and this kind of thing, one way for us to think about it, which is probably probably easier for us, is like one's inner life being projected outwards. There's sort of an explosion in Milarepa's life, a sort of explosion of an inner life into this bigger forum into which all sorts of interactions happen. And that's probably the way I would tend to think about it. The Tibetan, that wouldn't be the Tibetan worldview. It wouldn't be that demons and spirits and heavenly beings are part of one's inner world. That would just be the world. There wouldn't be this kind of division. That would just be the world in which they inhabited and expect to encounter. But if we looked at Milarepa sort of coldly and sort of like through a documentary lens or something, what we'd see would be a emaciated, skinny, raggedy-looking guy. Perhaps, some of the time, not all the time, he had a greeny hue to his skin because of his diet of eating nettles. So he'd be skinny. He would be ungroomed. He might look fairly unprepossessing. We might not be that impressed by him. and he wouldn't be bothered. He wouldn't be bothered by that. He's really not concerned with our good or bad opinion. What he is bothered about is enlightenment, not for himself particularly, but for all beings. And his life, he believes in his life as an example, of a dharmic life. I mean, just to say some of the aspects of his renunciant life. So he lived in quite a lot of different caves. He moved around, and once, occasionally there'd be encounters with people who were wandering around, hunters or perhaps shepherds or something like that. And one time, some hunters came to his cave and they were hungry, so they said, "Oh, have you got anything that we can eat?" And Milarepa said, "Oh yeah, I've got some nettles." So they start cooking the nettles, and they this needs some seasoning or something a bit more savoury. Have you got any meat or fat or something to season the food with? And he said, "Oh well, when I need seasoning, I put in nettles." So they put in some nettles, and then they were like, "Oh, it needs thickening up. Have you got any barley flour, perhaps?" And he's like, "Oh, for barley flour, I use nettles." And then, "Okay, let's put some salt in it." And he says, "Oh, yeah, for salt, I use nettles." So that's what they ate with him, and that's why he turned green. Not that one meal, but over successive, persistent following of the nettle diet. And actually, it's also interesting that amongst the hunters, we hear about the dialogues. So amongst the hunters, we get different reactions. So one of the young hunters is like, "God, why do you live like this? You could live in the world. You could do these things. You could do some stuff. You could have some stuff." So that's what he's basically saying. You could do some stuff, get some status, and you could have some stuff. You could have a house. And one of the older hunters says, cuts him short and says, "No, shut up. This man knows a lot more than any of us could comprehend." So it's interesting that Milarepa's bearing would have had different effects on different people. Some of them would have been unimpressed by his sort of degraded lifestyle, and other people do notice the wisdom in his bearing. So yeah, we have this picture of someone perhaps not looking that impressive, but then what we read from the songs and we read from his biography, that he's practicing meditation and reaching levels of bliss that we unlikely to be able to even bear. It's not like he reaches heights of pleasure that we know about. Like, there's pleasures too much for us to bear. That's why we don't get there. So he's meditating, having conversations in his meditations with Darkanis, who are sort of personifications of meditative bliss, who pour the nectar of bliss from the skull cup. So he's having these extremely intensely pleasurable experiences, and that's a direct result of his discipline, his faith, his faith in the Dharma, what he's willing to renounce. So he's willing to give up the smaller pleasures for pleasures that we couldn't even at this point we couldn't even sort of cope with. Yeah. And he talks about happiness being the death of passions. So not following impulses, even strong impulses, persistent impulses, not following them. And we know this, don't we? We know this about meditation. That's why we set up, when we meditate, we set up a particular space where we're going to be safer from those distractions. So we can put aside worldly distractions. We can put, for a start, we can put our phones down. We don't have a bar of chocolate on our meditation mat and just sort of we create space. We make a firm decision, and we have a time and a space, and we know that that's going to have an effect, don't we? So it's not like these the principles of the way that Milarepa's living are not completely alien to us. He's sort of taken it as far as any human being could. Bhante Sangharajita, he says in the book The Yogi's Joy, as a renunciant, he's probably even more extreme than the Buddha. He's probably does that for longer and further than the Buddha. And it's quite funny. Sangharajita says quite dryly that it's not practical for us to copy and emulate Milarepa's lifestyle. So it's thinking about, well, what are the qualities and what are the values that he's got to teach us? Because we probably couldn't. It's not like that we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't go into a cave and renounce the world and meditate the whole time. I mean, we maybe wouldn't take that much effort to make that decision, but we wouldn't be able to stick it out, and we wouldn't be able to get much from it. We wouldn't be able to respond that way. So what is like? It's thinking about those values at where we are at now, and that's something maybe we can reflect on. Just going to pause for breath. Are there any questions or comments so far?
I'm interested in your word singing.
Yeah.
And have you any idea what that sounds like?
I don't know. No. Yeah, I was thinking I could research that and do a performance. That would be nice, wouldn't it? I don't think it. From what I understand, I don't think it would be melodic. It would be. But I don't know. Do you know David Mitchell? That was the case.
All I know is that she had the reputation of having a beautiful voice.
Right.
But the traditions of music vary so much from culture to culture. It's difficult to quite know, because in the 1000s I don't think they had any recording equipment. So there's nothing we can compare it to.
They sing on a different scale in Tibet, so it sounds quite atonal to us, but quite beautiful. Yeah. But I think you're right. It probably wouldn't follow what we would think of as traditional melody and meter, but still might sound attractive to the ear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably someone's tried to recreate it. Probably.
Yeah.
There was a movie about Milarepa. There was footage of a scene where he's singing underneath a waterfall in Tibetan, but I think they took the sound off of it. If you type in Milarepa waterfall on YouTube, you'll see it, but I do believe they took the sound off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. There have been a couple of movies, I think, and anyway, I haven't seen them. Yeah. Anything else? Or we go to the next bit. Yeah.
I just wondered where I could find out about the story about Milarepa's nettle-based diet. So I really like nettles, but maybe not as much as him.
Well, I mean, I've given you the recipe. I don't know what I don't know how long he cooked them for. Yeah. That's in this book, his biography, which was written a few hundred years later.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm interested interested in your take on the spiritual versus the human aspects. You kind of like indicated that one way to interpret the presence of some spiritual beings amongst humanity is as a metaphor for what's going on inside a person. Can you say a bit more about that? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not saying that it necessarily has to be taken as literal, aren't you?
No. What am I saying? Well, I'll tell you what, I think the next bit I'm going to talk about will sort of unpack that a bit more.
Okay.
So hopefully that will, yeah. And if not, you can ask again. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think what we'll talk about next is, a bit more about this symbolic world that Milarepa inhabits or lives in. And, well, one point, so Milarepa was a Tantric practitioner. And Tantric practitioners is a school of Buddhism. A school sounds too formal, but a movement of Buddhism that was very, very direct. So the Tantric Path is the direct path, and what it points to is really here and now, practicing here and now. And it's interesting that Milarepa isn't he doesn't claim to be an incarnation of any other practitioner. So he wasn't like in Tibet they have tulkus, so they seek out and they see the sort of reincarnation lineages. So Milarepa was just an ordinary person, and he states this really clearly. He's like one person in a lifetime, an ordinary person can gain enlightenment. Instead of sort of deferring it for lifetimes and lifetimes, which sometimes it can seem like it. That's one way of talking about the difficulty of practicing rigorously. So everything is here and now, and that means that everything that we encounter is part of the path of practice. So it's not like we wait for the right conditions in order to practice. We're in the world, we're in samsara, we're in conditioned existence, and whatever presents itself to us, we take as something to practice with, to teach us. And there's this another concept about another way of practicing is that when we're thinking about, these are my words. Well, there are these archetypal Buddha figures, and one of them is Akshobhya, and that's who Milarepa, that's the figure that he practices on, Akshobhya. And Akshobhya has a pure land, and a pure land is a realm where everything is a teaching, everything reminds us of the Dharma, and it does it in a very, very beautiful way. So that there might be Dharma teachings in the wind, even the smells of the flowers or these beautiful scents might teach us the Dharma. So there's this idea of the Pure Land, and that can seem like that's somewhere else that we're trying to reach, like we might get there one day. But what Milarepa's mode of practicing of this immediacy is that the world is a Pure Land, because the world does everything, teaches us the Dharma. Everything that he encounters is symbolically significant and can teach him. And that's he's very, very responsive to that. So last week we looked at the story where his clothing got blown away by the wind, and he didn't want that to happen. And he realised he was holding on, his mind was holding on, and he realised that, and he was able to let go. And he had a very, very strong realisation of that simple thing happening, this simple thing of just something that he didn't want to happen, happening. So, I mean, if we could be like that, you know, like if every time, I don't know how many things that we've done today that slightly didn't go right, like if we dropped something or we didn't get the thing that we wanted, can we take that on as a teaching? Can we help us? Can we let that help us realise something truer about reality? So broken bowls, a lost robe, a lack of food, and what we're going to look at in a minute is an encounter with some demons. And there's this lovely quote about, in one of the introductions, which is a quote from a quote which he hasn't referenced, but everything in the outer world appears as scripture, and everything profane is sacred. So that's a description of Milarepa's world. The Dharma is present everywhere in this symbolic world. I don't know if some of you have had a taste of this, that when we're in certain mental states, the world does seem more meaningful. There's symbolism in the world. Sometimes I get this on retreat, and actually sometimes just walking through London on my own at night, particularly at night, or in a certain state of reverie, everything's more vivid. Everything seems more potent. There's meaning. I don't always. It's not that I could sort of calibrate the meaning and say this means that and that means that, but I'm receptive to meaning, and the world seems more magical, more resonant. So I don't know if you've experienced that at certain times, or certain modes. So last week, Jnanavacha promised us, he left us on a cliffhanger, didn't he? And he said that Milarepa he'd lost his robe, he'd had a realisation, he was feeling quite exalted, and he went back to his cave and he found this bunch of demons. He found 5 Indian demons, very evil looking things, and they're not Tibetan demons, they're Indian demons, it's quite specific, in his cave. And they're, it's not just that they're in his cave, but it's almost like they're pretending to be him. So one of them's preaching the Dharma. Well, no, one of them's preaching. I don't know what he's preaching, actually. One of them's, they've got his books open, they're studying, and another one is preparing his food. It's almost like they're laughing at him, or like doing a sort of charade of being Milarepa. Milarepa doesn't want the demons there. Who would? And I don't know loads about demons, but I have a sense that they can't be fobbed off easily. So they're not. I think they've got like quite a strong antennae detector for inauthenticity. So you couldn't just sort of usher them out of the room. Or demons, they've got a sort of detector for inauthenticity. So they might be evil or malicious, but they definitely can't be fooled. So Milarepa starts on the wrong foot. So he says, he thinks they might be demons or emanations from a local deity who perhaps, and Milarepa hasn't made any offerings to the place, so he thinks he's made an error just to not be grateful for the being able to inhabit the cave, and that these demons are an emanation of that. So he sings a complimentary song, and he says, "Oh, ye local demons, ghosts and gods, all friends of Milarepa, drink the nectar of kindness and compassion, then return to your abodes." Okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the demons, they can obviously detect that Milarepa just wants them out, and they're not going to follow that. So they start laughing evilly and they grind their teeth. And then what happens is he tries to impress them with his spiritual prowess. So he does an incantation to get rid of them, and that doesn't work. It's like he's going back to his old sorcery ways. So he just tries to use power to get rid of them. It doesn't work. The demons still remain. And one thing, I think demons can also be, they come about at periods of growth. So if we think of them as they're protecting something, and so if we're protecting something, sometimes we're holding on to something. And I had this when I was on my ordination retreat. So we were in Spain in the mountains for 3 months. That's probably the closest I'll ever get to living like Milarepa. And we had a period where a period near the beginning of purification. So we were doing confession, which means just telling people things that we've done that we feel remorse about. It's quite a strong practice. I found it very strong. And my dreams during that period were riddled with demons. I mean, I don't normally have that sort of fantastical imagination, but I had demons sort of coming up from the murk of my unconscious. Terrorizing my dream. My dream life was irksome, to say the least. So that they can, and that was because I was in a period of growth. It was purifying to do that. So the demons remain, and Milarepa suddenly has a realization, and he realizes he's addressing them as real things. So this is where I hope I can speak well, because this is important, that he's addressing them as real things, and he says, "It's foolish of me to dispel them physically." So he's taking them as manifestations of something, as real, actual things. First of all, he tries to flatter them, and then he tries to use power. Then he remembers the time not so long ago where he lost his robe, and he had a strong realization about the emptiness of all phenomena. So it's like that happened. He had a moment of inspiration, and then he went back into his older ways for some reason, and then he realizes, oh yeah, my mind is full of illusions, the world is full of illusions. It's like I don't accept the demons on the terms that they're presenting themselves to me. And he sings a song. He sings a song of inspiration. He says, "I am void, the demons are void." And the song that he sings features some of his symbols, his special symbols of eagles, golden fish and snow lion. And I love to think that there are golden fish in the rivers of the Himalayas, but I don't know if that's true. But the eagles and snow lions, certainly. Yeah, so these demons, they're perhaps just shadows of something still lurking, a sense of longing, and he just realises that they're just not. They don't have any inherent meaning or existence. So what I want to point out is the difference here between a psychological approach to demons. Okay, so we don't need to believe in the Dharma to have some feeling for demons, the archetype of demons in our own mind. You know, there's quite a lot of, you might have read Feeding Your Demons, that sort of thing, creating, or demons being aspects of our psyche that we don't want to look at. Yeah, so that's really, really good, fertile ground for growth, doing that. So looking at having our demons. So I might say I've got a demon of jealousy, and it might even have a clear form or a sort of feeling, or it might be a demon of craving, or those kinds of things. And psychologically, that's really, really helpful, because it helps us to look at parts of us that aren't being included in our lives. So that's energy that's not being used. Okay, so that's really, really liberating. And we don't need to need to have a feeling for the transcendental in order to do that work. So there's this whole other aspect. The wisdom aspect of Milarepa's understanding, which you couldn't apply too soon. So you couldn't just say, my demons of craving, they're just illusory, so it doesn't matter, You can only do it when you really, really, really understand it. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying about the difference between a psychological and then this wisdom aspect, which always addresses things, or a better way to put it, never addresses things on the terms in which they present themselves. It always got another, a bigger picture aspect to it. Stop there for a question or comment, see how we're doing.
I think it's a little bit like the kind of psychological aspect, a bit like it makes me think, I don't know a lot about it, but Carl Jung and his shadow side.
Yeah.
That kind of.
Yeah, but I don't know much about it. But I think you're right. I think so. Yeah. Because that's filled with he's really interested in archetypal symbolism, and it's a really rich way to explore human experience. And it's not the end.
And that we have to include the sides of ourselves, even ones that we don't really want to look at and we don't like.
Yeah.
To be whole.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least there's I'd rather be whole than good, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And Milarepa in his life, he really had to confront. He murdered 35 people with his black magic. So he really had to. That's a strong thing. He really faced up to that. And he keeps facing up to these things. And he's got a realisation that's even bigger than that. In the Yogi's Joy, it's described as enlightenment being his own transcendental nature, and it allows him to live and move in the transcendental realm. Yeah, which is, I think that's why he decides, that's why he's living in the way that he does. It's like the landscape, the mountains, everything that's the world that which he chooses to move around in and inhabit is like the natural playground for him and his as in the same way that the eagle flies in the sky or the fish swims in the water, there he is in the mountains. And with that was a slight digression actually, but with the demons, when he sings to them. Because he doesn't believe in them anymore. In the same way, he's got no wish to get rid of them at all, and he invites them to stay. Genuinely, he invites them to stay, and he says, even though you look like you want to go, but no, stay. Come on, we'll talk about the Dharma, and they vanish. So the demons vanish. Are there any more questions around that? Yeah.
I suppose that bit at the end is quite interesting, kind of inviting the demons to stay even after you'd kind of dispelled them or they wanted to go. Because I think to kind of take that like symbolic breathing further, it maybe suggests that you can never kind of entirely get rid of your personal demons except kind of welcome them or be aware of them or whatever. I guess that's a good question, not a statement. And that just struck me as interesting.
No, I think you're right, and if Milarepa embodies anything, I think it's a liberation of energies, and in order to liberate energy, you need to be aware of it. So we can, and in order to be aware of it, we need to look at the whole of our experience and uncover the whole of our experience. And he does that in the service of the transcendental. Yeah. Have I talked? Does that come to your question a bit more?
Yes, it does. I'm aware how it sounds. It sounds like Milarepa himself understood that these demons weren't actually real.
Yeah.
That he himself understood that they were symbolic. But then earlier on, you seem to be saying that people in Tibet understand it differently, even though Milarepa himself understood that they were just symbolic rather than real.
No, that's a really good point. So I think a less modern worldview would be to have a more literal belief in these sort of things. And Milarepa wouldn't be differentiating between demons or his robe or his bowl, so things that we would say that's real and that's not. They're all symbolic for him, and they're all manifestations of mind. So what he's really getting at, which is where I start to fall down as well, is that another way to put it is the world of appearance is all demon or cup or table is all a manifestation of the mind, and what's beneath that is that's even that's the wrong way to say it, but what the mind, the realised mind that Milarepa has access to, sees behind, through all of the manifestations of the world of appearances. So everything is the nature of shunyata, of emptiness, which can sound like nothingness, but what I'm hoping to show from the richness of Milarepa's expression is that realising the void isn't nothing, isn't nihilism, is another way to describe it is fullness, is mystery. So do you see that the demons are no more or less symbolic than a broken bowl that which your food falls out of, or a a lost robe or the dropped firewood. It's all of the nature of mind, and that's where the liberation is. That realization.
Do you know the Bodhisattvas? How look at Siddhartha and so forth?
Yeah.
Is it best or is it useful to imagine them as being kind of like symbolic rather than being, actual people that lived or creatures that exist, or beings that exist?
I think what is useful is to imagine them in the way that's going to affect us the most strongly.
Imagine them as?
In the way that's going to affect us most strongly. So they're conditions. And if we probably have more of a tendency in our milieu to imagine things as symbolic. So if we err towards the over-literal of these things, we're probably better off than just sort of... It's probably better for us to go for something more tangible to counteract the views at which we are.
It's really interesting, especially having, coming from a kind of like Christian materialist background where there's angels, there's God, so on and so forth. These spiritual beings actually exist. But to imagine them as being, to imagine bodhisattvas as being symbolic is kind of like opening up a whole new perspective. Because as much as what, I like the stories of the bodhisattvas and so on and so forth, they do seem incredibly fantastic.
Yeah.
Up until now, I've been kind of like understanding them and explaining them as stories to inspire.
Yeah.
Rather than actual things which actually happen.
Yeah.
But to think of them as like ongoing symbolic beings is probably a new dimension for me.
Yeah. Well, I think if we do that, we need to take the world of symbolism very, very seriously. I don't mean that in a that sounded a bit sort of telling offy, but just to take that to heart, to allow us to be affected as strongly as possible by it. Yeah. I just want to end. I'm going to end. I'm going to read part of a song from the Yogi's Joy. Which I hope is evocative. So it's just half of it because it's quite long. This is the Song of the Yogi's Joy. Because of the fear of thirst, I sought for drink. The heavenly drink I found is the wine of mindfulness. Now I have no fear of thirst. Because of the fear of loneliness, I searched for a friend. The friend I found is the bliss of perpetual shunyata. Now I have no fear of loneliness. Because of the fear of going astray, I sought for the right path to follow. The wide path I found is the path of 2 in 1. Now I do not fear to lose my way. I am a yogi with all desirable possessions, a man always happy where he stays. Here at Yolmo Tagpu Senge's song, the tigress howling with a pathetic, trembling cry reminds me that her helpless cubs are innocently playing. I cannot help but feel a great compassion for them. I cannot help but practice more diligently. I cannot help but augment thus my Bodhi mind. The touching cry of the monkey, so impressive and so moving, cannot help but raise me in deep pity. The little monkey's chattering is amusing and pathetic. As I hear it, I cannot but think of it with compassion. The voice of the cuckoo is so moving, and so tuneful is the lark's sweet singing that when I hear it, I cannot help but listen. When I listen to them, I cannot help but shed my tears. The varied cries and cawing of the crow are a good friend and a helpful friend unto the yogi. Even without a single friend, to remain here is a pleasure. With joy flowing from my heart, I sing this happy song. May the dark shadow of all men's sorrows be dispelled by my joyful singing.